Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. We do a lot of things on this podcast, but the most important thing we try to do is take a moment to think about our thinking and think about the ways we can change our ways. Those who listen to us often know that this is podcast that tries to fulfill three goals, many more, but three primary goals. One is to explain what executive function is, what's the role of prefrontal cortex in self-actualization by translating the research findings from many, many fields, including neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, and many more into meaningful bits that apply to everyone's life. Second goal we have is to connect the plight of the current self with this aspirational future self. And more we bridge the gap between the two, there's a chance that we can actually take care of the needs of the future self and become a better version of ourselves faster and with great strategies. And last but not the least is to help people create some sort of playbook for not just personal success, but success as a community member, as an activist, as a change maker. And that so much depends on mastery of executive function because that centers around self-control. So as we talk about this, one of the things that has been on everybody's mind is how do we talk about becoming the best and the greatest citizens of this American life here, and those who are listening to all other parts. We get listeners from 90 countries, so I'm very, very excited about that. So the most important thing, though, is how do we understand experiences of those who are not do not belong to the majority, and particularly after George Floyd's death, we have had incredible a chance to open some dialogue regarding that. So, with that in mind, I was just going to make a reference to a journalist just published a book about operations of FBI, and it was so interesting. There was something that she mentions in her book, which is a story that goes many in 2001, LA Times reporter Eric Lichtblue, I think, wrote the story titled FBI Settles Black Agents' Discrimination Lawsuits. And it was very interesting because in that, one of the things she writes that a federal judge on Monday approved a sweeping settlement in a 10-year-old lawsuit between the FBI and some 500 current and former agents who contend they were systematically discriminated against because they're Black. And the experience of those Black agents was treated, every individual, when they mentioned, it was treated as a minority. It's an exceptional experience of one individual. But when collectively everybody gathered together, there was a systematic behaviors. And they included hiring practices, promotional practices, their ability to join elite teams like SWAT teams. The reason I'm mentioning all that is when we look around and we think opportunities, this is a land of the free and opportunities are created equal. The question really is it so? And if it is, then should we be complacent? And if it is not, should we take action? And what are the fears and barriers? And with that in mind, that's why it's my great pleasure to invite this incredible researcher, Dr. Daren Graves. He's an associate professor of education at Simmons University, where his research lies at the intersection of critical race theory, racial identity development, and teacher education. His work has been published in numerous academic journals, including developmental psychology, applied developmental science, and youth and society. He also co-teaches critical race theory in education at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And he currently serves, which is very interesting, I want to talk to him about, is co-chair of AERA Hip Hop Theories Praxis and Pedagogy's special interest group. One of the reasons he is joining us is because of his incredible book, which he co-authored with Dr. Scott Sider, which is called Schooling for Critical Consciousness, Engaging Black and Latinx Youth in Analyzing, Navigating, Challenging Racial Injustice. Welcome. Sorry, it took a while to set up the stage, but welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
My pleasure. Thank you so much, educator, for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
So I ask a lot of my guests about executive function and their own understanding of their own executive function. And since your work is taking a deep dive in critical consciousness, how would you describe your own critical consciousness and your awareness of your own abilities as an individual learner, but also as a person who's trying to make an impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate it. I think I'm thinking of critical consciousness, as being, drawing from Paulo Freire's definition and conception of critical consciousness as, the ability to recognize, social and political forces, and then to be able to take action against them, right? And especially to the extent that they might be, holding others down or oppressing others. And so my own critical consciousness is really rooted in my family and in the tradition and in the African American tradition of education, right? And so I come from a legacy here in the U.S. where education was denied to my ancestors, either outright or through not providing anywhere near the means that we would need to have high quality schooling. And that was very much based on faulty notions of Black folks as not being intellectual or not being capable of, being, highly intelligent. And so in that context, we come from a legacy, we being Black folks, in America, come from this legacy of, seeking education, seeking schooling in the face of all of those challenges, as a means to both, affirm our own humanity, affirm our own, become authentic authors of our own futures, and also to help transform the larger society, to remove those barriers and obstacles from us as Black folks and everyone. And so I come from a long legacy of educators in my family and otherwise who have instilled in me the importance of learning more, achieving highly, and that my success comes not when I succeed, but when those who come behind me succeed. So I'm standing on strong shoulders, and I need to be strong shoulders for the people coming behind me.
I love that. And you exemplified that through your work and the teachings you do, and in different communities that you belong, including the Muslim community lecture. I had an opportunity to listen to you about that as well. So just to get a little bit more in-depth clarification about the Brazilian educator that you mentioned, Paulo Freire's definition of critical consciousness, which you summarize in many places, including with your colleagues, that inequality is sustained when the people most affected by it are unable to decode their social conditions. I just think that's such a powerful way to think, that you're basically trying to survive, but to take a look at your condition in the context of others requires some type of awakening or some type of experiences that takes you outside your realm of being. So can you tell us a little bit about this decoding process? What social conditions, because the conditions are designed to make you not aware of them, right?
Exactly.
So how would you explain or elaborate on that?
I really appreciate that. Yeah, the systems that are at play, whether they're systems that are organizing people's opportunities on the basis of race or gender or sexuality or religion or ability, disability, like all of these systems are super powerful and operate and have been operating since before we got here, and probably since maybe after we're gone. but because they're so pervasive, and and like you said, they're sort of organized in ways for you not to really think about them. Even the people who are most affected by them, right, might not even understand how that they're operating or how they're operating, right? And so I think we have, a narrative in the United States that very much centers people's efforts and decisions, right, as the things that will help and effort, right, and that will be rewarded or not, right, in terms of and it really presumes that there is a level playing ground, right? So if you presume a level playing ground where everybody has the same opportunities, right, then you should be judged on. I mean, your progress and your success is really a function of how hard you try, did you make the right decision, so on and so forth, right? And so with that, an over belief in that meritocratic system then leads even the folks who are victimized by some of these systems of oppression to see their own lack of relative success, or some of the symptoms of those systems as a function of their own poor decision making, or cultural features that might be disconnected from the institutions like school and otherwise where people attain success. And so it really can lead to situations where you are blaming yourself or your own community for issues that are really about structures that have been placed on top of your community that have really constrained the options for agency moving forward. And so there does need actually to and for folks who have privilege, that's there's very much those systems of privilege are very invisible. So that's a whole different story for the folks who have privilege. But for the folks who don't, there still often needs to be an intentional project to help these communities see what the systems are that are constraining their possibilities and how they operate, so that they can have that, as you described, an awakening to then figure out what to do next.
Two thoughts come to my mind. One is the story of Benjamin Franklin, who was it was I heard I had never heard it phrased that way, but he perpetuated the myth of rags to riches, where he, as the printing press owner, actually announced an initiative. If people brought their rags, he could trade something, and then eventually he became very rich. And so he always put this narrative out that if you work hard, if you tried your best, every citizen of this country has that potential and opportunity. But it's a lie, it's a myth a little bit, because those opportunities are not created equal. And second thought was Daniel Tatum talks about this invisible escalator, right? Moving moving escalator on which the people with privilege are automatically propelled towards progress, and the ones who are we're walking at the same pace but can never reach. Can you tell? So I'm going to tie this back into the topic that we can talk about. Is you're a developmental psychologist. Before we begin with this work of critical consciousness in youth, can you take a moment to talk about the psychological makeup and struggles of the marginalized children and youth, and what are they battling with that might get overlooked by traditional educational approach?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So as a developmental psychologist, I'm super interested in identity development, writ large, and it's particularly racial identity development. Um, and so, which is really like the impetus for the project of the book. And so, but I'll just say it like this. You know, you know, when it comes to issues of race and other kinds of identities, right, socially constructed identities, we are all bombarded with, so many messages about who people are, who we are, on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, other identities that have really profound impacts on how particularly young folks see themselves, right? And so if we're trying to understand how young students of color, for example, come to see themselves writ large, come to see themselves as students, come to see themselves as folks who can thrive in schools, that's coming in the face of a tidal wave of messaging and a tidal wave of ideas that have existed for now, like, centuries, that have called into question the ability of, certain groups of color to be, to as intellectual beings at all, right? Um, lots of messaging about, people of color from a deficit lens that really frame them as deviant, dangerous,
Mm.
um, you know bodies that need to be policed, minds that are not fully formed and need, lots of help to overcome that, so on and so forth. And so what that really means is, so what I'm always concerned about is, you know and these messages are coming from, lots of different places. It comes from media, it comes from institutions, it comes from, it's in the air, right? It's virtually impossible to not be impacted by these ideas. And so I'm very concerned about, in the face of these tidal wave of ideas about particularly young folks of color and their communities through a deficit lens. What does that mean for how they come to see themselves, right? And it's not uncommon, sadly, for any of us, whether we are in that, minoritized group or not, to internalize, the messaging and the problematic ideas that underpin different people's races and identities, right? Which for students of those identities means that you could be seeing yourself through a deficit lens, right? And there's lots of research that shows that this definitely happens. I mean, the most famous example of this came in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, where the Clarks, Mamie and I can't remember the man's name, but the Clark, they were both doctors, psychologists, and they did this famous doll test where they would put white dolls and black dolls in front of black students, and they'd say which doll is nice, which doll is bad, which doll is mean, which doll is smart, which doll is right. And what you found is that, young black children were looking at the black dolls and evaluating them as dumb, worse, bad, mean, especially relative to the white dolls, which has real implications for, how they're seeing themselves. That same doll experiment has been replicated in the 21st century, and we're still seeing those same outcomes, right? And so that just speaks to, the ways in which there are huge barriers that are being put in front of, particularly communities of color and young folks of color around, developing a healthy sense of identity, a healthy sense of self, a healthy sense of who I am, who I can become. And so those are the kinds of issues, and those are reinforced. Again, those are reinforced by teachers. Those are reinforced by, lots of institutions, media, so on and so forth. And so I'm really interested in thinking about ways we can be intentionally helping young folks of color in particular develop, a positive sense of identity, because those positive identities is associated with all the kinds of outcomes we're interested in our young folks, whether it's academic engagement, achievement, civic engagement, resilience, so on and so forth.
That's excellent. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think, we literally, from educators' perspective, people think that students come and all students are made equal because they're sitting in front of me. But what psychological and historical, cultural background they bring are so diverse, and one may not be privy to that. It's interesting. I'm soon going to publish another fantastic guest, Roy Richard Grinker, and he's an anthropologist, a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, and he talks about this. His work is about disability and stigma associated with social construct. And one of the interesting stories that in his books he writes about that in 2002, Japan decided to change the Japanese word for schizophrenia permanently, or remove it from the official vocabulary, because it connotated permanently ruptured mind, and replace the word with integration disorder. And now 10 years later, 20 years later, there's a deep psychological impact on the way people see with those diagnoses, and their acceptance has changed. And so similarly, I think what you're saying, and I didn't kind of set the stage that well with the FBI story, what I was saying is when they investigated the stories of those 500 who had filed a lawsuit, one example was one of the agents who served in Chicago and Omaha said that the white agents would post photographs of apes over his family pictures at his desk, and subjected him to other racist treatment, which is very subtle, very, but it was a culture. That means, one, it was permitted, and second, it was not objected or penalized. And so, as you talk about critical consciousness, I think what I'm hoping to hear further about is changing the ones who witnesses and those who experience it, right? So tell us about. First question comes to mind: are educators able to contribute to helping change identities? Because what part of their education really prepares them? Because identity, we think about from subject of study, comes from anthropology, sociology, cognition, so much more complex. So how do you see education being the place where this happens?
Well, yeah, this is a great question. So, schools, can definitely impact and does impact people's sense of identity. And so, there's a few ways to think about it. There are some folks who say, and I understand this, right? Well, is it my job, or as an educator or a parent saying, is it educators' jobs to really be helping students, figure out and navigate identity? And I have two responses to that. One is that whether we like it or not, it just is, right? It's just happening, right?
Yes.
It's almost like
Yes.
some of the debates around sex education in schools, right? There's some people who will say, well, I don't want my children learning about sex in schools, and I can understand that, right? And there's a lot, especially those educators who work with like grades 6 through and above, will say, look, whether you like it or not, like, young folks are learning about sex in schools. They're just learning it from each other, right? And so the question becomes,
Yes.
like, what do we as
Who's
adults,
the source?
Right, exactly. What do we as adults, should we as adults be doing to help, intervene in that process? And I say it's a similar thing with schools, like whether, based on, who's visible in the curriculum, who's visible as staff and experts around them, what are the kinds of relationships between students and teachers? What are the kind of relationships between teachers and the communities? There's a million different ways that, whether you're thinking about it explicitly in that way or not, are sending powerful messages to young folks about their identity. And so that's my way of saying, whether you like it or not, it's happening. The other way I think about it too is, it's a a kind of a poor feature of the way that K to 12 schools are going in the United States. But when you do early childhood education, by the way, when you're doing that early childhood education, that identity development is the job. That's the job. That's
Yes.
what teaching is. Like,
I love that.
Young
Yes.
folks are not getting graded on whether they can apply the Pythagorean theorem or not, or right. They're really getting graded on their social and emotional capabilities, right? And what happens, unfortunately, that the further we move away from early childhood education, the job of what teaching means, or what being a good teacher means, moves further away from explicitly thinking about identity development, and way more focused on like delivering curriculum, being an expert in the content area. And I think that's a massive problem, because of course, especially from a developmental psychology perspective, the entirety of life is a process of developing identity, of course. But if we're sending young folks, we were making young folks go to school every day for 7 hours a day, right? And we've already made the case that school is impacting people's identities, right? And so we what happen at times, whether it's in pre-adolescence, especially adolescence. I mean, these are times of massive you know um, opportunities for folks to be thinking about and developing identity, and yet the teachers in those grades are really moving away from that, right, and thinking more about delivering instruction. And what I'm saying, by the way, is especially when you get into adolescence, here's what a lot of schooling sounds like, right? And when you're in a classroom, hey guys, come on, get it together. you guys need, stop talking, guys do that, a lot of redirection, right? But what's happening is we're making young folks go to school, rightfully so, and they're trying to figure out who they are in the process, right? They're trying to figure out who they are,
Yes.
and we're sitting there going, no, stop that. We need to like do the math problem now, or read this, right? And so I'm really urging educators in a variety of ways to really understand that, again, whether they like it or not, identity development's happening, and they need to be figuring out, how, if at all, they need to be playing a role in that. And that doesn't necessarily always mean, pulling some separate social and emotional identity, curriculum out from the side. Like, even if you're a math teacher, right? You, whether you know it or not, whether it's through your curriculum, whether it's how you're interacting with folks, people are learning about their identities. A really great example is a really famous sort of social I think it's more of it's a psychology experiment where they've asked like thousands of U.S. children to basically draw a scientist, right? And when they draw a scientist, right, it's all, like 95% of these pictures are of white men, right? And so what does that mean?
Yes.
That means that if you're not a white male, or if you're not a white man or a young white man, right, becoming a scientist, unless we're doing some intentional work around this, becoming a scientist means overcoming your race and your identity, right, and your gender identity to then, buck the odds to become, right, a scientist, as opposed to, of course, there's scientists come in all shapes and sizes and identities. But again, if we're not being intentional about helping young folks understand that, then it shouldn't be a surprise when we're having issues, engaging folks who basically aren't white men, right? To engage in the field, in the study of science, or whatever the topic is. And so, some of this work is it takes on many different forms, right, around helping young folks develop a sense that, yes, I am an intellectual being. I come from a community of scientists or mathematicians or so on and so forth, right? The way my teacher interacts with me and my community helps me understand that I am capable of all these things, right? So educators are doing this, whether they're doing it wittingly or not. And I'm urging educators that they need to be way more intentional about thinking about the ways that they are sending messages to help students develop a positive sense of identity.
I love that. I was recently in an author's a release of Janice Kaplan's new book called Genius of a Woman. And in that she tracks stories of women in a variety of ways, and she refers to another experiment that was done to talk about different fields and who is the pinnacle representative of that field, and not a single woman. The children could not name a single woman. So the belief was, if I don't see them, if I don't know them, they must not be good at it. It was never viewed as there was no opportunity, right? And so anyway, in her book, she talks about all these amazing scientists who actually were either married to, or they're, including Albert Einstein's wife, who also was quite a bit of talented mathematician. So let's talk about now applying your theory to practice effort that you did with Scott. So in this book that you and in your research project, actually, you talk about how schools can help Black and Latinx youth resist the negative effects of racial injustices and challenge its root causes. So in order to do that, what was the status? What were children doing? Were they aware such oppressive practices existed? Did they even know that there was an opportunity, or it was only facilitated by the educational experience?
That's a great question. So our research project took place in high schools, right? So we were really dealing in this case with adolescents. We were intentional about not presuming that the students were coming, and this is by the way, a very Freirean, Paulo Freire kind of way of thinking about it. But we were presuming that the students were coming in with some knowledge already, with some understanding already, right? that they weren't coming in
So lovely.
as empty, as blank slates that the schools were then there to like fill out for them, right? So we didn't want to presume that they were coming in without any knowledge of this. And by the way, given that they were young Black and Latinx students in a lot of prominent kind of East Coast cities, we were more likely to presume that they did have some sense of what was going on. And so we tried to organize.
And there were 5 schools that you studied, right? You'll explain that. Okay,
yeah,
please
there's
explain.
5 high schools, schools that had missions that were intentionally around developing either some measure of critical consciousness or civic development, and we were trying to figure out what kind of different kinds of approaches that schools took to help young folks both understand how how these social forces are at play, and then what they could do about it. Okay, and so we actually followed, and the great part about this study is that we actually followed the students from the beginning of their first year in high school to their very end. So it was a longitudinal study. So we got to see how this looked over time, which we were also super interested in. So then the kind of data we collected both quantitative and qualitative data. We used surveys to measure different components of critical consciousness to see how, if at all, critical consciousness was developing over time, right? And then we also collected qualitative data.
Can you give us examples?
Yeah.
Of what kind of questions judge the critical consciousness in students?
Oh, yeah, they were just different. I mean, so for me to explain that, I have to dive a little deeper into the ways that we're conceptualizing critical consciousness, which has basically 3 components.
Would you?
Yeah, basically 3
yes,
components.
Yes, please. I meant to ask you that first. Yes.
So if you remember,
please.
My definition was that I was using was the ability to recognize these forces and to take action against them. And so we see critical consciousness as having 3 components. One is social analysis, right? That's the recognition part, understanding that these systems exist and how they exist. We also see this, another component is social action, right? Which refers to a variety of types of actions you can take in order to push back against these systems. And then we have this third piece that's called political agency, which is kind of the bridge. We see that as the bridge between analysis and action. And political agency is sort of it's basically like efficacy, right? It's the feeling that you can make a change, right, if you wanted to, right? And so there were actually different scales that were looking at analysis skills, I don't know if I'm going to remember the exact types of questions, but these are going to be questions that are really going to be asking about students' ability or sense of understanding how different, systemic forms of oppression work, right? We'd have questions around action. We'd have some surveys that were around action that were really asking students, senses of, what they could do or what they have done, right, to be able to push back against these systems. And then the surveys around political agency were really focused on their belief in their own capabilities around doing any of the work that would involve transforming these systems. And so we collected data that showed, and I don't think I'm giving away too much by saying that yes, in all of these schools, over 4 years, we saw growth in all of those dimensions, which really helped us answer the question, was critical consciousness developing? Before I keep moving on, real quick, we did see, and I will come back to this, we did see that certain schools, maybe the students showed more growth in one of the components compared to the other. So some of the schools did really showed more growth in terms of action versus analysis versus agency. Okay, so that's that piece. The qualitative piece, which is even more fascinating to me, was the many days and full days and hours. I think we spent over 360 full days in different schools.
Unbelievable.
Doing full day observations, and then doing periodic interviews with students and students in particular, and also some teachers as well, to really connect the dots. And this gets to your original question about how much the schools were influencing their critical consciousness. So we were trying to do both observations and ask specific questions that really linked the growth that we were seeing in the students to specific practices that we were seeing in the schools. And we felt most comfortable about that when we identified practices that we saw ourselves through our observations, when those matched up with the ways the students themselves identified those practices as influencing their ability to either do the analysis or the action or gain some sense of agency. That was the data. The data was really trying to both see, was there any growth, and so we could say yes to that. And then the qualitative piece was really trying to figure out, well, how if at all can we attribute what was going on in the schools to that growth. And if you want, I can talk a little bit about the things that we saw or the things that the students identified that contributed to that.
I would love that. And for our listeners, I'll summarize a few things here that, you saw that many factors that influenced positive youth outcomes. And what you saw was greater resilience, better mental health, higher self-esteem, and of course, higher academic achievement, which probably would be the only factor of interest might be for educators. I'm
Right.
teasing here, but
that's
I think this
real.
is what we want. We want children to be resilient. So tell us, maybe you can walk us through a couple of schools, what they were doing. You have such incredible stories that you talk about. Including, the countries that banned, visiting the neighborhoods. Such interesting stories.
Yeah, no. So let me talk about it.
Do you want to share a few?
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll try and share three. The one that kind of speaks to each component, right? And I'll make it quick, I promise. Some of the schools did really well with, their students did really well with the social analysis piece of critical consciousness. And then those schools, what we found is that they often built into their core curriculum, right? Whether it was within sort of the traditional classes like English or social studies or other things, or creating their own class that all students took, that really introduced them to frameworks for understanding how these systems work, right? And so one of the schools that we highlighted, they introduced these students to what they called the three I's. The three, and by I mean the letter I, three I's framework,
yes.
which was a way of categorizing the different ways that, for example, racism can manifest. And in that regard, it was, it can happen on an interpersonal level, right, between people. It can happen on an internalized level, which we've been talking about already, the ways in which we absorb, these messages around
racial
race.
attitudes.
Right, exactly. And then it can happen on an institutional level, right, which happens through policies and structures. And so in this class, the social engagement class that I think in this case, all ninth graders took, right, they learned about this framework and got a chance to play around with it. And then what we saw is that because, all the ninth graders were taking this, we saw throughout the year, both throughout ninth grade and beyond, the way that other core classes would then use that framework in their own classes. And so one of the examples we highlight in the book is how the ninth grade English class was utilizing Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, right, a text that they probably teach anyway, as a way to help them understand notions of internalized racism and internalized standards of beauty, right? So the schools who did that really gave students a lot of important tools for analysis. For action, what we saw is a similar kind of model, but in this case, we saw models where, in one of the schools, students in the 12th grade this is a class that all 12th graders had to take. Okay. So again, the incorporation into the everyday schooling of the students, where they learned actually different theories and methods of organizing. Okay. And then after taking this class in their first semester, they had a senior year graduating culminating project that required them to choose a topic of importance to them in their community, do the research, and then produce and perform what they call a change the world project, where they had to take the learnings that they had done about the specific topic, move it out into the world and do some kind of action, and whether that action was in the form of confronting institutions that were doing things that were discriminatory, whether that was just doing a public service announcement so folks in their community, could understand what's going on. The example that you gave that you mentioned was of students for whom the French consulate had actually
I love that.
declared their neighborhood, the neighborhood that they go to school in and they live in, as essentially a no-go zone for French citizens. If you're going to come to travel to this city, don't come to this neighborhood because it's scary. The school found out about it. The students found out about it. They did a lot of research, and they ended up confronting, the general consul in that city to urge them to change that, essentially a travel ban, right, to their community, which they eventually did, which was amazing, right? And so in those cases, the schools build in the action part of doing the action out in the world as part of as part of the learning, as part of the core learning. The last thing I'll mention is schools where we saw students displaying high agency, right? The feeling that they can do it, make changes, is that these were schools that provided meaningful, again, usually through core courses, meaningful opportunities for the young folks to shape the school environment, right? And so we talk about an example where schools, where one of the schools through an 11th grade civics class gave the students an opportunity to revise an unfair school policy, and these students in this case, decided to try and make a revision to the school technology policy, right? The ability for them to be able to use their phones or other tablets, right, to be able to do work and other things. And so the students went through this whole process of, again, research, making a whole presentation to the faculty. They presented to the
I love
faculty.
that.
The faculty, did they give them what they wanted immediately? No, they actually scaffolded a process for them and said, hey, wait, we have some real questions about this, right? Pushed back a little bit in ways that were both genuine, and some also about scaffolding a process for them to understand like how this works in real life. Um, and then at the end of that process, you'd get students saying things like the textbook definition of agency. They would say things like, wow, I didn't know schools would listen to young students, right? And now that I made a change here, I feel like I can make a change anywhere, right? And so those
Love
are the
that.
kinds of different practices that we saw, and we feel comfortable attributing those practices to the results that we saw, because it was also backed up by the many interviews we did with students over the years, where the students would say that I learned about I became more aware about food deserts in my community, and it was my social engagement class that really helped me see this in ways that I hadn't seen before. So we had lots of amazing data on the qualitative end, where we got to see for ourselves the ways that the schools were scaffolding these processes, and then amazingly, students organically telling us the ways in which those processes impacted their thinking.
I mean, there's so many examples made my heart just dance and eyes teared up sometimes. But there was one example of Terence who said achievement as resistance. That was such a that as achievement as resistance was such a powerful way to keep at school, recognize that there are a lot of forces who are banking on me dropping out, or they don't care if I don't finish, but if I care, I have some agency. And I mean, that's just the most beautiful thing. And it's really interesting. So my real question is, why is this not happening everywhere? Why is critical consciousness curriculum is not all pervasive?
Right, right. I think, well, that's a tough question. I think the answer, sadly, is politics. And so, what do I mean? Yeah, I mean, there's so much research, even beyond the research that Scott and I did, that shows, and like you said earlier, like even if you're just only interested in high test scores, or high academic achievement, we have the data that shows that critical consciousness and positive racial identity is very much statistically like correlated with outcomes like GPA or test scores, or whatever it is that you're interested in. And so under those circumstances, it begs the question even more. So, like, well, why isn't everybody doing this? Especially, right, in the context where all these researchers and policymakers are trying to figure out, especially for students of color, like, well, how can we, make sure that we can, that we're not seeing these disparate outcomes, right? And so, why would we not be doing this across the board? I think the reality is that um, Paulo Freire said that, in his work, that we read the word in order to read the world, right? In other words, that we learn these functional literacies and numeracies, not just for their own sake, right? But so that it can eventually become critical literacies and transformative literacies, right? And to me, that does not sound like a really radical notion, right? That we are teaching students skills so that they can become authentic authors of their own future. That does not sound radical to me. It becomes radicalized, unfortunately, in the context of students who have been minoritized on the basis of race and other things, right? Because in order for them to become, right, authentic authors of their own future, we're going to have to surface, ugly dynamics like racism, like patriarchy, right, like ableism, right, and sort of looping back to the
Nepotism.
beginning, right. So looping back to the beginning parts of our conversation, there's ways in which, when those systems are invisible and aren't talked about, that's kind of that's sort of a goal, right? That's sort of the ideal in the United States, is that we shouldn't be encumbered by these systems, right? But sadly, because different parts of the society are in different places around their sense of whether we should be foregrounding those issues, thinking about those issues at all, right? Now that we're talking about racism or ableism or these other isms, that now makes it, to those people, seem like a radicalized project, right? And now and maybe even a form of indoctrination. And so I think my response to that is as follows. And again, this sort of takes on, the kind of ways that Freire looks at education, that education is inherently political. Now, I want to like distinguish between political and partisan. Okay. Education being partisan, that I can understand, especially in the U.S. context, how that would not be an outcome that we're looking for, right? That does more lean into the realm of indoctrination. But I don't know what education. I don't know what an apolitical education is. Like, I don't even know what that means, right? We make everybody go to school in the United States, right? And a big reason for that is so that they can, and a laudable reason for that, right, is so that folks can be, useful and educated, contributing members of our democracy, right? One of the biggest, reasons that people were scared of democracy when it was first brought up was like, these people don't know nothing. Like, these people can't. How are people going to make decisions about how to be governed if they don't know nothing, right? And so we solved that problem by, I don't know, making people go to school. And so schooling in that level alone, right, is inherently political. And so in this regard, if we're, so in this regard, yes, when we're doing critical consciousness, the political realm, of education comes right into the front and center, because the whole notion is that, what does it mean to have a vibrant democracy if folks can't participate in that democracy, or not allowed to participate in that democracy one way or another? And so I think what it really involves is helping people understand that while, yes, we are, helping young folks think about some of these issues like racism, that doesn't mean we're trying to indoctrinate them into a certain way of thinking. And I think the real concern is that a lot of this work that foregrounds, race or racism by some folks, is that we are teaching young folks to hate America, or to hate white people, right? Which is just so far from the truth. Like, we are just trying to talk about, and by the way, critical consciousness is for everybody, right? We're all participating in these systems of oppression, that we all need to figure out how we're doing how we're recognizing and what we're doing about it, and either in terms of reinforcing it or trying to dismantle it. But the point is that this is the kind of work we need to do in the face of the reality of these systems, to help young folks see themselves in a way that isn't through the deficit lens. And to your point, Sucheta, is to give them a sense of agency to be able to do something about it. So there's lots of platitudes about how, America is going to become a better place because the children are the future, and our young folks are going to make the changes that we can't. But that doesn't happen magically, right? And that definitely doesn't happen if
No.
you're a child who doesn't have any sense of agency over their own future, or doesn't have a sense of identity that says, you can and should be making positive changes for yourself and the larger community. So that's what this work is about. And I think if we did that in a way that was part of the mainstream, no one would push against that. No one would say, wait, why are you trying to help students become authors of their own future? But when that process foregrounds some of these other systems that are more taboo and that are harder for people to want to reckon around, then people get nervous about whether or how this work should be done.
That this is so well said, and you're kind of mirroring the concepts that Paulo Freire talks about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. There's a portion there that he talks about fear of freedom. Freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man, nor is it an idea which becomes myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion. I just love that. So I think I'm wondering, as we talk about the oppressed, what do we talk about? How do we address the critical consciousness of those who are not intentionally oppressing, but they are part of the system that's benefiting them? And they may feel incredibly uncomfortable if certain parts are pointed out about the privilege that comes their way. And this is where I feel there's such a rub. How do you see this apply to all children? And adults?
This is important, right? So look, the way these systems of oppression, they've been going since before we got here, and they're going to probably be going since after we're gone. And so I think part of the deal is to help folks understand that because these are systems that churn and they go, whether we like it or not, that it's, I think there's a sense that like, oh, these systems are just going to peter out. Like, the old people are going to go away and, pass on, and then the new people will come in, and then that'll usher the era, a new era. And that's just so not the case. That's just not what history dictates, right? All you have to do is look at what happened in Charlottesville. What was it, like 4 or 5 years ago? Those were not old people walking around with torches on that campus. Those were young folks, right? So that's one. Two, like, these systems of oppression, based on what your quote from Freire, they're upheld by people who have power and by people who don't, right? They're upheld by both groups, right? And so there's no way that we're going to dismantle these systems without the folks who have the privilege engaging in this work. And I think U.S. history dictates this, right? There are ways in which, when we've made big leaps forward in terms of social justice, it's often occurred when, folks with privilege have decided to get on board this process and become part of the process. That usually helps us make big steps forward. So this work needs to be done with, for example, if we're talking about racism, it definitely needs to be done with white folks, for example. If we're talking about patriarchy, it definitely needs to be done with men. Okay. And so what is the way that we can help folks do this, folks with privilege do this without feeling, overwhelmed by like guilt or shame or whatever kind of negative emotions that might, make them not want to be part of this process? What needs to be done is to help them understand that, like, this is not, you should not feel shame, guilt around having privilege, right? Because, like I was saying before, we're born into these systems. Like, nobody asked to have unearned privilege, right? And so I reject approaches that either try and shame people for just having privilege, right? I think that's a problem. And I reject I reject notions where people feel like, oh, I have privilege, therefore I just need to, like, be quiet, shut up, wallow in my guilt, because that's also not going to be helpful. Like, it's not helpful for, it's not going to help dismantle any of these systems of oppression to have the folks with privilege just sitting there wallowing in guilt and shame about it. No, we need people to, and it's going to require action. And so in that regard, I think we need to help reorient folks who have privilege to feel less shame and guilt about whether they have privilege or not, and more guilt and shame around how are they utilizing their privilege or not, right? So if you want to
I
feel a
love
sense of
that.
like, you want to feel a sense of like, guilt or whatever to help, push you forward, it should be around what are you doing about the privilege that you have, right? That's the thing that should move us forward. And we all need to think about that because, like I said, again, even when let's say we all decided, locked arms together, agreed that like these systems of oppression are bad and we want to get rid of them, it's going to take so much work, even when we all agree, right, to make them go away because they're so powerful and so pervasive. I mean, we had a constitution that gave everyone the right to vote, and then we needed to
It
have
didn't matter.
amendments to make that actually happen. Then we had to have more, civil rights acts, after that to really make it happen. And we're still dealing with it, right? And so it's always going to take tons. And again, building on your Freire quotation, it's a process. It's not a destination. It's always going to require us to do work. So we need people's energies focused on getting involved in that work, whether it's work they need to be doing themselves and or work they need to be doing collectively, from their different levels of power and privilege. And to realize that, like, look, you might have power and privilege. Great. You didn't ask for that, but now now what are you going to do about it? Right. So I think that's the key to this issue. I think too often we have either approaches that are misguided or approaches that are misinterpreted that really frame the issue as like, oh, you have privilege, therefore there's nothing you can do, right? Like you just have it. All you can do is just go away, right? Or just not be who you are. And that's just not useful. So we want to give folks with privilege, guess what? A sense of agency around this. There's something you can do about this. Right?
Absolutely. And I'll end this that one of the beautiful things you say in your book is that critical consciousness is an antidote for oppression. And this is how you just explained how this is possible. And the other very positive message you leave us, that you see measurable, as you said, objective, subjective, and transformative changes in youth, which is what we want. And I just can imagine the power of, if we have such kind of army of new generation who pauses and problem posing pedagogy that Freire talks about, which is really like taking contemplation into saying, being serious about problems that we see, and not just turning your back and saying, oh my God, I'm feeling overwhelmed. So as we end, do you have any suggestions for our listeners? What books you tend to look at that you find inspiring and that influence your thoughts?
Yes. Let me say one other thing right before that, if that's okay. I think
Oh yes, please.
we're also long overdue for a revisioning of what schooling needs to be, right, in this country, right?
Yes.
The way I describe it is we have like a 19th century school schedule that's preparing students for 20th century jobs, right? So we are way overdue of trying to figure out what school needs to be, and I think this, the pandemic moment that we've had, right, that really forced us, it has really jump-started a process of re-envisioning schools, what school needs to be. And I think that critical consciousness needs to be a part of that, re-envisioning.
And executive function training.
Exactly.
Teach children how to think for themselves and manage their lives with intention.
100%. Thank you for saying that. In terms of books that I think that you could read more about, I would start with Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which really helps you orient yourself to the political nature of education and the kinds of authority you need to have with students, right? And in a Freirean model, it's way more of a reciprocal model of teaching and learning between students and teachers than a more of a vertical authority model where the teacher has all the information, all the expertise, and is just depositing it in to the student's head. That's not what we're trying to do. We need to see our young folks as having expertise in those communities as being experts on their own condition and drawing from that. So that's one book that I would mention. Another book that I would mention is Below the Surface, by two great scholars, one Deborah Rivas Drake and and Adriana Umanya-Taylor at Harvard Graduate School of Education, who've done amazing research. And it's a very readable book about racial and ethnic identity, right? And so if you're really interested in
That's great.
thinking about what racial ethnic identity is and how to promote positive racial ethnic identity, I would suggest that book. And the last book I would suggest is Cultivating Genius by Dr. Gholdy Muhammad, which I think is just a beautiful example of, through especially like literacy curriculum and otherwise, how we can be meaningfully integrate some of the key components of critical consciousness, especially around identity, especially around analysis, into our everyday lessons. And so I would highly recommend that book as one type of example of how we could be meaningfully incorporating critical consciousness type work into our schools.
Well, my goodness. So I have to admit, I have not read the other two, Paulo Freire's book. Because of your and Scott's work, I got introduced to it last year. So I can't wait to read these two books. I'm curious if you are familiar with Baba Ambedkar, Annihilation of Caste. I will send you some information about it, but he is from India. He is he was a champion of speaking against oppression and creating the critical consciousness and changing the voice and giving agency. And his work had great influence on MLK. And they were in correspondence with each other, which I recently found out, but very interesting. Well, that's all for us now. Thank you for tuning in and joining this deep and meaningful conversation. If you are enjoying our podcast and love what you're listening to, please share and like us on many social media and spread the word because this is important work. And to me, executive function skills is changing the way you look at the world, become more aware so that you understand the changes you make benefit not just you but others. And lastly, there's so much work to be done in the community where you belong and the larger community that you don't see, but that change is not possible unless we pause, reflect, and then respond and not react. So if you don't practice critical consciousness, you will be in the mode of reacting, and that's not good for anybody, right?
Exactly.
So thank you so much, Daren, for being with us and being absolutely an incredible guest. I am so grateful. Thank you.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.